writing is actually at the core, and it's that kind of a difference we're working with here. The spoken speaks the written, not the written writes the speaking. The spoken.
Well, there's also, I mean, again, going back to the notion of pi, right? We can symbolically represent pi with the actual Greek letter pi,
just by writing.
but we cannot represent the totality of pi. It's impossible.
Right.
Because to try to do that, where does pi end?
Or for example, this is a very common, you may have heard this, I mean, because it's extraordinarily common, is when you talk to physicists about quantum physics. Quite frequently, they're more than happy to talk to you about the general purposes of quantum physics. But if you really push them and you say, well, explain to me really what's going on in quantum physics, the response that I've gotten from every single physicist that I've ever talked to, or even people like lay people moderately informed in physics is, look, quantum theory only works out in the math. You can't verbalize it, you can't explain it in that fashion, it's just how the math works out. And if you really want to understand wave functions, what you need to understand is the math behind them.
Would it be fair to say in this discussion that like representation is more like direct appearance, right? Like just seeing things, understanding things in a sensual sort of way, whereas presentation, like in representation, there's no standing in the place of, right? You're not like putting something in the place of something else, right? It's direct appearance. Whereas like presentation, you're always putting something in the place of, like you're symbolizing it with pi or with like a formal system, right? Is that close?
Yeah, as long as if we're talking about something that can only be symbolized, as long as it's not just, because I could write pi and say it means that door.
Yeah.
But if pi means something that is genuinely inconsistent, then it can only be symbolized and not imagined.
Yes.
Right. The other way I think of that's helpful here is to understand what is meant by imaginary in the Lacanian sense. If it can't be imaged, if you can't see it, then it's not in the imaginary.
Yeah.
So, you can't see pi. You can symbolize pi. You cannot see it.
That's right.
So I think that's a fairly simplistic way of putting it.
A bit of a qualification though, I mean, obviously the appearance as opposed to being is somewhat helpful, but if we're going to stay true to the text, we should also keep in mind that what is represented is that thing that is rendered consistent
By the count.
by the count, right?
By the representation.
Yeah, and so in this case, it's not just, oh, well, you directly appear to me, right? I mean, we could go through all sorts of scientific, biological reasons, but nevertheless, you are rendered consistent to me by the mechanisms of my consciousness.
Right.
It's in a sense that you can experience the totality of data. Actually,
Yeah,
that's
your
actually a bad
appearance-
thing.
Yeah.
The way to put it is, your appearance in front of me is not some sort of given ontologically. It itself is a representation of a presentation that is inconsistent.
Okay.
Is the
Okay.
question.
So,
Does that make sense, Dave?
Well, so what you're saying is that if something, even in symbolizing it, can't be rendered ever consistent, can ever be rendered consistent, even in.
well, one is consistent, but pi is not, right? Well, the number 3 is consistent, right? It's just
No, I'm saying right, okay, I'm saying if it can't be rendered consistent by symbolizing, then it is.
Right. And the
Presentation.
reason it's not rendered consistent is that it remains unimaginable. It remains in its inconsistency.
And-
The axioms guarantee that.
But it's presentation if that's
Right.
the case.
So I mean that's why if I write pi plus 3 here, right, that makes the inconsistent thinkable ontologically. I can think pi plus 3. I can't imagine it, but I can think it. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about, right? So in other words, I mean this the imaginary number is completely unthinkable in an imaginary sense. It's completely unthinkable in terms of representation.
Well, so now you're making a distinction between thinkability and imagination.
So,
or
well, okay, so if
imaginability.
you put it, to talk about the thinkable, there are two ways to talk about the thinkable. And the problem here precisely is that usually we think there's only one way of talking about the thinkable. There are two ways to talk about it. It can be imaginable, or it can be symbolizable. And usually, I mean, our everyday way of talking, and usually in philosophy as well, these are collapsed into one. If it's not imaginable, it's not thinkable. And what Badiou is trying to talk about is, no, even if it's not imaginable, it might be thinkable, because it can be thought symbolically.
Well, and again, a bit for you, but also for the folks back home, is there's other ways of thinking things through that are not simply, again, this imagination. For example, how does one think a revolutionary struggle, right? This is a question of politics. And obviously what you don't do is you sit and imagine things and imagine, this fantastical world and how you're going to overthrow capitalism and whatnot, right? The way in which you think politics is through political action. That's the discursive mode.
That's right.
Which, for ontology, right, the way in which you think ontology, contrary to Heidegger, contrary to the history of philosophy, is not by imagining, right?
Yeah.
Or being thrown into yourself in your own most. No, the way in which you think mathematics is through through symbolization.
Where you think ontology is.
And the way that Badiou puts it in his book, The Handbook of Aesthetics, is he says every truth procedure has a writing that's all its own, which is the level of the symbolic. So that in politics, it's the literality of an evental account. In love, it's the love letter. In art, it's the belles lettres, the beautiful letters. And in math, it's mathematical symbolism.
Okay, so presentation will not be imaginable, right?
Pure presentation cannot be imagined,
But it is symbolizable.
but it is symbolizable,
Or it
and
could
that's
be
what set
symbolizable.
and set theory does.
Thank you.
Okay.
Very helpful, everybody. Thank you.
So,
Appreciate your.
all on the same
Well,
page.
maybe just to make the point, I think, where Badiou goes with this is this sort of, right, you have a symbolization that tries to capture the excess. Because maybe we'll talk about excess later, but.
Yeah, hang off on excess, because that's going to be a crucial part of this, especially the whole second part, so in a
Okay.
week we'll deal with that.
Worry about that later.
So let me get one other thing on the table from Plato, and this is this question of Platos and Pola. I want to make sure that it's, I wish Badiou had written this part a little differently, because I think it's easy to lose what he's doing in this part of the meditation. Because he sounds like he's arguing against Plato, and then he says, actually no, but Plato's doing something different here if you actually look at the Greek. So I think he leads you down a path that can confuse you. So the way, I got a nice little chart I looked up on this. So if the one is not. There are two directions we go from there. The one is the direction of the Platos. Platos. And the other is Pola. Platos would be literally translated here as multiplicity. Pure multiplicity. This is the proliferation to infinity in the dream. Pola here would be the many, but in the sense of many objects, many things counted as one, right? And what Badiou's point is to say that Plato uses makes a clear distinction in the Greek, though because we're sloppy ourselves, philosophically, we tend to translate these as the same words. And that misrepresents what Plato himself is doing. So over here, as I say, we have this dreamlike, we can say the dream, this proliferation to infinity, and so forth, which means that over on this side, we have ontology in a kind of proto-Kantorian sense. Plato has here recognized what ontology actually must be if the one is not. But on the other hand, he talks about this question of the many, and when he talks about it in terms of the many, this is where he doesn't think all the way through the question of the one, as we talked about. We end up with this aporia that leaves this minimal link of the nothingness of being to be not non-being, right? But what we end up with here then is this question of the proper name, pure nomination. So that these two halves of Plato's of the directions that Parmenides goes in Plato's dialogue gives us two crucial elements of where we've got to go next. If we take this to the question of the others, we end up with a proto-Kantorian ontology. If we go in the direction of the one and its vicissitudes, if the one is not, then we end up with the pure nomination of the proper name. Now, Plato himself can't quite go far enough with this, as Badiou goes on to argue, precisely because he doesn't seem to recognize the gap between the one, that is, and oneness as an operation. However, these two things are exactly what Badiou wants to get from this. We need this Kantorian ontology for all the reasons we've been laying out. We also need this proper name, which is the point of both meditations 3 and 4, really. Am I saying that right? Or 4 and 5? 4 and 5. Meditations 4 and 5 are going to be dealing with this.
Really quick, so when we covered this earlier, when he says the one is not, he's saying actually the one is multiple, which is to say how you get multiple of the multiple going around with those. Yes or no?
Say that again?
So what is specifically meant by the one is not? Is that in context of what we were talking about earlier, how you switch the question of multiple into one? So to say the one is not is to switch, right? Instead of saying the question of being as one, the question of being as multiple.
I think these are both consequences of that rejection of the
Yeah,
one.
these are both rejections of the one.
So to think the multiple as multiplicity, right, which is the
This is to think the others.
inconsistency of the one.
Okay,
This is to think being, the being of the one. That
Okay.
isn't.
really quick one more time.